Alia, my name is Wambui Gaitha. I run the Regal Africa Group. I am an international trade and investment expert, and that is the work that we do at Regal Africa, which I founded in 2015 with the sole goal of helping Africans on the continent and around the world to create wealth on the continent. So the first thing I wanted to talk about when we talk about wealth creation in Africa is really talking about that wealth creation is only going to happen through sustainable trade and investment. We are no longer talking about poverty eradication. And the word poverty, we've seen it a lot on the continent. And now we're saying the only way that that happens is for us to focus on wealth creation, because it's the only sustainable way to eradicate poverty on the continent. And when we talk about trade, we look at trade as being the key to long-term sustainable economic development on the continent. And so the AfCFTA is the answer to that, right? Because it is through the Agenda 2063 that we will see sustainable development of the continent. And the AfCFTA just makes sure that we say that we're going to see the free movement of goods. We're going to see the free movement of services. So we have a borderless Africa. We'll see the free movement of capital. So a lot of work is being put there in regards to different policies to ensure that happens, and the free movement of people. The fact that I in Kenya will be able to travel to Senegal, South Africa, Egypt, Tunisia without worrying about visas or any other restrictions, that would be a great thing. So the Africa that we want, and the only way for us to see wealth creation on the continent in a sustainable way is through trade and investment. So as I mentioned earlier, that when we're talking about wealth creation in Africa, it's through sustainable trade and investment and free movement of goods, services, and capital, and the people. So what are the opportunities that we see when we talk about Africa trade? The opportunities that we see is, like I said, brought about by the AfCFTA, covers a market of 1.3 billion people, right? We have a GDP of over 2.5 trillion, and it's across 55 member states of the African Union. So what we're saying is the AfCFTA is the world's largest free trade area since the formation of the World Trade Organization. And so the opportunity for Africans to trade is to start saying, beyond your domestic opportunities, we need to think about regional, and in the past panel, we talked about beyond the RECs, which are the building blocks. We then need to then think about going continental, and then definitely in the future, we go global. So it is all a systematic way for us supporting African businesses, especially the SMEs, to be able to build capacity for them to take access to markets all over the world. And so we're saying we start regional, continental, and then globally. So the key here for us when we talk about strategy and wealth creation in regards to sustainable trade is really talking about value addition and the creation of African brands. That is the way we're going to see sustainability of African trade, because we buy mostly what we trust, what we are familiar with, what gives us value for money. So the way for us to be competitive on the African continent is to do that. Showcase the African brands, showcase the value, and that is how we're going to see more of our products being consumed on the continent and beyond. Now, when we look at the African business landscape, most of them are SMEs, right? And so we are saying, because of technology, and as you can see, we are all online right now, we need to take advantage of digital trade. This is the easier way to actually take up opportunities beyond your border, whether it's trading goods, trades in services, because this is the way that you can start off doing business with people. People will be able to do a bit of due diligence before they actually take the time to actually go to that particular business wherever you are in any other African country. So we need to look at, we need to be taking advantage of digital trade. And I also wanted to highlight a few businesses or a few industries that we at Regal Africa believe are very key when we talk about trade in Africa. One is food. Again, we are blessed to have huge amounts of arable land on the continent. We can feed the continent and feed the world if it's done the right way. So you need to be looking at opportunities in food, opportunities in beverage. We need to be looking at opportunities in fashion, in beauty, especially for women. They like those two industries, and we see a lot of women on the continent. We also see opportunities in flowers and business services. We have a young, vibrant, educated populace of Africans, and they're able to offer business services from anywhere in the world, whether it's marketing, whether it's accounting, whether it's legal, whether it's human resources, basically technology, and the youth who are educated will be able to take advantage of these opportunities globally and on the continent. So you want to pay attention to these six industries if you're looking to see opportunities on the African continent. When we talk about Africa economic transformation, what we always say, it has to be inclusive. For it to be sustainable, it has to be inclusive. So for it to be inclusive, then we need diversity. We need to change from what we saw in the future. The first thing I wanted to talk about really is around leadership. When we look at leadership on the African continent, it has always been an African man, an older African man. What we're saying is that for us to see economic transformation on this continent, we need to see more leadership that actually the reflection of the population in the African continent. So in leadership, we need to see more women. We need to see more youthful people in leadership, because they are the ones who know what is actually happening on the ground. And so they can be able to provide the right policy, the right viewpoint on how we can transform our communities, all the way from continental, national, to the grassroots level. So when we think about economic transformation, we cannot forget about leadership. The other thing we need to look at is really around products. As you can see that each African country is known for a certain thing. In Kenya, we are known for tea, right? So the question is if anyone from any other African country wants tea, shouldn't they be purchasing it from Kenya? Or if you want coffee, shouldn't you be going to Ethiopia? If you're looking for gold, wouldn't you be going to South Africa or Diamond in Botswana? So the goal here really is to say, if you're going to have economic transformation on the continent, we need to be aware about our diversity. We need to be able to know what each African country is able to produce, whether it's goods or services, and we need to be able to consume what we're producing on the African continent. And if we focus on that, we're going to see the growth of intra-Africa trade through the right policy and ensuring that governments are providing a conducive environment so that businesses can be able to then grow. And like I mentioned earlier, when we look at SMEs, most of them are women and the youth. So if you're on the continent, you believe there's economic transformation that is happening and will happen in the future, then what we're saying is look at leadership, consume what it is that we produce, and we will see transformation in the years to come as we work towards Agenda 2063, which is the Africa we want. When we talk about creating wealth for Africans, because that is something very dear to us at the Regal Africa Group, and which I believe is why you're participating here at the Africa Trade Conference, because we keep saying trade creates wealth, right? So what we're saying when we're talking about creating wealth for Africans is we need to be able to say that if we grow our businesses, if we see business growth, this will lead wealth creation to the business owners. And when the business owners have wealth and they're able to expand their business, we're also going to see job creation. So the issue of unemployment will cease to happen, or at least will be reduced, because we're supporting the business community to grow their businesses, and we will be able to then ensure that poverty eradication happens on the continent. So there are three ways we look at creating generational wealth sustainably. The first one is through the businesses themselves, right? Most businesses on the African continent are SMEs, but from our research, we've actually found out that most of these businesses are family owned. Now, because they're family owned, the way they are run is different from most of the businesses maybe done globally. And the issue around succession planning is a big issue. So for us, when we came up with, and as we continue doing research on this, we're saying for us to create generational wealth, we need to support SMEs who are family businesses, and we want to make sure that there's good succession planning to make sure that the businesses last more than the generation. So we are not only starting all the time, but we're building up from where the last generation took the business. The other thing that we've been seeing in regards to creating generational wealth, the African context, is really having more community projects. This really works really well in rural development, but the challenge we have seen in the rural development is to see the aid mentality there. So for us, we're saying for Africans to create wealth, we need to have more community projects, but with a commercial agenda, which means that any project that goes into this community has to be sustainable. It has to be looked at as a business, and it has to be able to have the right management, the right resources, so that it lasts. Otherwise, if you use the old mentality or the aid mentality, once the project ends or the money stops, then that project ends. So we need to make sure that generational wealth is being created in Africa by having commercial agenda. And the third thing we're looking at is really around nation building. Governments need to come up with the right policies to spark trade. We've had over through the conference and beyond that we have enough policies, right? But we still believe that we need more policies, especially focused towards women and the youth. Because if we do that, it's going to spark trade and no one is going to be left behind. We also see the need around investing in the right infrastructure to ensure that trade happens. We can have the right trade policies, but without the infrastructure, that will not happen. And so when we talk about infrastructure and trade, they go hand in hand. So when we're talking about sustainable trade, we have to improve the infrastructure, and we need to own the infrastructure. The first thing when people think about infrastructure, they think about physical infrastructure. That is the road, the rail, air, port, energy. Those are the big, very capital intensive infrastructure that are handled by government. Or in some cases in Africa, we're starting to see more of the PPP projects or financing coming in, where it's private-public partnerships. This is very critical for that to happen, because I might have a good in Kenya, but if I want to take it to the DRC, will I be able to do that without the right infrastructure? So we need to improve infrastructure to make sure that trade happens and it happens sustainably. The second thing we really need to look at is digital infrastructure. This means telecommunications, data centers, fiber, cloud services. This is very critical, especially when we talk about digital trade, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. When we talk about digital trade and bringing on board women and the youth and the rural community, digital infrastructure is very key, because if there's not enough of good digital infrastructure, then it means that we're leaving behind a part of the population in Africa, whereby then we will not have sustainable trade. And the third type of social infrastructure we really need is education, transformation of the mindset of the Africans, that opportunities are abundant on this continent. And then we need to build capacity for us to know how to take advantage of these particular opportunities. Healthcare, that was mentioned earlier, water and sanitation is very critical in Africa, and of course, housing. So the goal here, we're saying when we tie infrastructure is to trade, and trade is to say that we as Africans have to collectively come together, own our infrastructure, build our infrastructure, And then that way we can be able to have more intra-Africa trade, and especially the last mile connection. Because historically, we've seen that most of this infrastructure was built out. People trade out, but now we need to start trading inwards. So that is why it's very important that we own our infrastructure, we build our infrastructure, and focus on intra-Africa trade. The key again here when we're talking about trade in Africa is really trading in natural resources, right? We in Africa need to use our resources in an effective manner, right? I mentioned earlier that arable land is abundant. So it baffles us at Regal Africa, but there's starvation happening on this continent, yet we have arable land. What is it that we need to do to make sure that that happens, right? Africa is almost like an island, right? There's water all around us. So the blue economy is very important. We can take advantage of that. What is it that we're not doing right? Why aren't we taking advantage of the oceans around us in Africa? Natural resources, we have a lot of minerals under the ground. Who is taking these resources? Who is investing in mining? Who is investing in this extractive industry? Why aren't we taking advantage of this? So we need as Africans to be able to use our resources, like I said, very effectively. Renewable energy, we have abundance of lakes, we have abundance of solar, right? So let's do things the African way. And the most important resource that I believe that Africans have is the youth. We have an educated youth world. It is a blessing. It is a blessing for Africa and the future of Africa. So we need to be very effective and efficient, ensure there's effective and efficient productivity to ensure that there's sustainable trade on the continent. Take advantage of all our natural resources and support one another so that this becomes a bright future for, like I said, the generations to come. And so with that, I'll be ending on the topic around sustainable trade in Africa. Earlier I mentioned that we believe at Regal Africa, the only sustainable way to eradicate poverty is through business, right? So trade, not aid. We are going beyond that. We're saying for this to be sustainable, we need to invest in trade, which means that we need to support entrepreneurs because they're the economic engine for growth. And entrepreneurship is not self-employment. It is not owning your own business. Entrepreneurship is building businesses that will last generations, that will create jobs, that will take advantage of the opportunities on the ground. So we need to have that entrepreneurship culture versus the self-employment culture. We need to go into more formal entrepreneurship as opposed to the informal entrepreneurship. That is what we've studied. That is what we've seen will be the game changer when it comes to sustainable trade on the African continent. And when we do that, we will see more access to markets for SMEs, and African businesses will be able to see access to affordable finance, because that's a big challenge for SMEs on this continent. The rates, whether it's debt or the requirements for equity investors, is so high that becomes a challenge for any entrepreneur. So for sustainable trade to happen, we need to have affordable finance, and we need to build capacity for our businesses to achieve what it is that they want to achieve. And so I want to end by letting all of you know that we at Regal Africa have a program called We Trade Connect, and it is the solution for intra-Africa trade and exports to global markets. So we are not looking at it from nations of Africans. We're talking about intra-Africa trade. We're saying that if you're looking to buy tea from Kenya, coffee from Ethiopia, cocoa from Ghana, if you're looking to buy wine from South Africa, you can actually come to this platform and be able to know who are the businesses that are supplying these goods or these services, and be able to buy from them after doing your due diligence. And the goal for We Trade is not only intra-Africa trade, but export exports to the global market. So that again is the work we continuously do at Regal Africa. We have a Center for International Trade that we continue doing research. We continue looking at how do we support more trade on the continent, because that's the only way wealth will be created. And if wealth is created on the continent, then the idea around poverty will be eradicated. So thank you very much for joining us again for the second Africa Trade Conference. My name is Wambui Gaitha from the Regal Africa Group. If you want to talk about trade or for us to support you in your countries, whether it's governments, whether it's institutions or business association, you can reach out to us. We have the Trade in Africa program where we focus on intra-Africa trade. We also have Trade with Africa programs where we talk about trade between Africa and other global destinations. So reach out to us at Regal Africa and we will be able to support you to make sure that wealth is being created for you as business people, for you as nations, for you as institutions, and that way we will ensure that this is sustainable. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us for the second Africa Trade Conference. And now we will then go on to our next session, which we will be talking about the REC. But before we do that, we're going to have a break. I see it's around 11:24. We will take a short break unless we have some questions. Are there any questions from the audience? Do you have any questions from the audience? Okay. Let's see. I don't see us having any questions from the audience. Yes, hi.
How are you again, Anne? This is John Bosco.
Yes.
I want just to appreciate you for giving that preamble on trade as a tool for wealth creation. My question, you know, there has been anecdotal evidence saying that trade, despite its importance in terms of wealth creation, but it has also widened the gap between the rich and the poor. So how do you, what is your response in terms of inequality? Because this is the current development discourse saying while trade is good in terms of wealth, but it has also widened the gap between rich and the poor because of trade, globalization. So I wanted to get your insight and your view. How do we ensure that it's not only a tool for wealth creation, but it is also a tool for sustainable and inclusive growth, sustainable and inclusive growth, so that doesn't leave anyone behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kaliso, for that question. And it's a very important question because yes, there's a wealth discrepancy on the continent as it is globally. And I think I tried to point it out a little bit in my presentation. The challenge we have seen on the African continent is the informal nature of our businesses, right? And the size of our businesses. In order for you to be able to get more bigger market share, more revenue, you definitely need to think differently. That's why we're talking about entrepreneurship. So the challenge we see is we have a lot of businesses coming up on the African continent, but it is about self-employment and informal, which means a lot of these traders are really thinking about day-to-day trading versus wealth creation and living a business that will be inherited by generations to come, or a business where other investors can come in. So what we're saying, in order for us to see the wealth gap changing, whereby now we have more Africans participating in trade that is sustainable, that is worth their time, then we will need to make sure that we are supporting all these SMEs to, one, become more formal, two, they need to think outside the borders. So I'm in Kenya, right? right? I need to be a business that is saying, can I take advantage of the opportunities in the East Africa community? Can I take advantage of the AFCFTA? That is where our SMEs need to go. And you cannot do that alone. What I have seen that has happened on the continent is a lot of the wealthy people are able to come together. They come collectively, they build partnerships, and they build big things. Versus majority of us who do things on a small scale and we do it alone. If you do something alone, it is not going to be successful. So we need to go back to the African way of collectiveness, right? Collective prosperity. So that is why I mentioned when we're talking about generational wealth, we need to think about not only from a family perspective where you're thinking about your family business, but you need to think about it from a community perspective. And then you need to think about it in the national way of doing it. So I hope Mr. Khalifa answered your question, which is to say, the way we'll see more wealth being created in a sustainably way and trade happening on the continent is if we make more businesses formal, more scalable, and for them to take advantage of the opportunities across borders. Thank you very much.